Welcome to another edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike, sorry, that was a little maybe too exuberant.
Too exuberant, yeah.
How you doing?
I'm feeling kind of sad.
Oh my!
How's that for a start?
When I was walking over here, I was like, I wonder how Mike's going to open up. And my bet was that you were going to say something along those lines. I get it, but I miss the optimistic Mike.
What do we have to look forward to now? The monsoon's almost over.
Yeah, so everybody that regularly tunes into this would know why Mike is in such a sour mood.
I'm just really surprised you're as upbeat. This is your favorite time of the year.
Yeah, it is. I have to balance you.
Okay. That's probably true.
So thanks everybody for tuning in after that rant. We're going to try to make some sense out of this monsoon season, which, as Mike mentioned, is rapidly coming to a close in quite a depressing, distressed state. There were a few blips in there where things were looking up, but overall, it's been a pretty bleak season. A monsoon, as they say, not just here where we are at the mothership here in Tucson, but
climatology has failed me.
Climatology has failed you.
Everything that I've constructed my world around, the average has not been helpful this year.
Yeah, so let's do it. Let's give our take on the monsoon, do a deep dive into the monsoon, and we'll save all of the other climate talk for next month.
Right.
Monsoon, Mike, give me your take.
I'm not sure.
You're not the best color man for nothing. And that's it. That's our podcast.
Wrap it up. We even had an emergency pod a couple of weeks ago to check in with, I think, a little glimmer of hope in our eyes that things were going to pick up over the last couple of weeks, and they have not
they fell
much.
Off the cliff. But let me paint the picture here. I only need one color.
Okay, which color do you want?
It's
gray?
No, it doesn't matter what
darker
color.
Gray?
It's just associated with
dark gray.
It's associated with low precipitation values, right?
Right.
So if you look at Arizona, New Mexico, and you look at a percent of average map since June 15th, beginning of the monsoon, 90% of the map is covered in below average for the most part.
For the most part. Okay, it is probably 90%. I was actually looking for an upside there. I think you're right.
Within that depressing big picture, there has been relative differences. We just got to say that
we got to mine out some.
Yeah, this is a monsoon that's going to come in very likely as it would take a miracle for there to be more sort of near to above average than below average. I mean, I think we can say that pretty convincingly.
Yeah.
The monsoon still has a month left. I mean, people call it September 30th
right.
the end, but for all intents and purposes, maybe it's a few weeks before that.
Yeah, it's usually about September 15th for much of the places in Arizona.
So we still have a month remaining, but this is the descending limb.
Yep.
We're past peak monsoon. I feel pretty comfortable saying that many places around the Southwest will not come close to average.
Getting to the cumulative totals towards the end of the season, you start to get locked in to below average unless you start to get amazing totals towards the end.
So just a little roundup. We'll first start in southern southeast Arizona. Tucson Airport, close to 50% of average, 2.2 inches. At this time, they usually are around 4 inches. Douglas Airport, 60% of average. Nogales Airport, less than 50% of average. Sierra Vista, 66% of average. Oracle, 70% of average.
Are you eyeballing on those percents?
I'm doing eyeballing these percents, so don't quote me on that.
I was watching that. I think numbers are actually in inches.
Yeah, I know. I think it works, though. I'm pretty good at math.
That's great.
Safford, 55%. Wilcox. I mean, we could go on and on. So Southeast Arizona, you guys get the picture.
We want to kind of break out to the broader region, too. So Flagstaff has had just a little over an inch. Towards end of August right now, they're headed for their driest monsoon on record if they don't get any more rain, which I think is unlikely. I'd expect they would get some more rain here, but if we locked it in, they would be driest on record since 1950.
Wait, so this is 60%, 70% of average that I just rattled off in some places southeast Arizona isn't that bad. But what you just said is Flagstaff is coming in at it's rolling in at the driest on record.
So right now, Flagstaff from June 15th to August 22nd has had a little over an inch. And so for that period from mid-June to middle of August is the driest on record. There's a record from 1897 prior to the sort of establishment of the official record that was even drier, but I don't buy that record. So I think that maybe just is possibly bad data. So in the contemporary record, they're right now sitting at their driest summer through this point. Northern Arizona has, for all intents and purposes, not had a monsoon show up. If you look at Phoenix is at 0.27 inches total. They've had 3 events so far this monsoon season. So just totaling to over a quarter over 3 events is pretty miserable. And then Albuquerque is at 2.41 inches through the middle of August, and they're in better shape and just a slightly below average to that point in the year.
I want to go back to Phoenix because it also looks, looking at these plots, it also looks like Phoenix at its current trajectory is also streaming toward a record dry. So you said 0.26. Yeah, you said 3 events. Those are really small events.
They are very small events. Yeah.
And they're usually at, on average, it's 2.5, a little over 2.5.
So as of the 22nd, that would be the 3rd driest from June 15th to August 22nd. So 1993 and 1991 were drier.
93 and 91. Okay. We have to go back quite a bit of time.
Yeah, to start seeing sort of similar activity there. Given our examples of like Southeast Arizona, and we're talking about Tucson. So what was the Tucson number? We're at 2.22 inches through mid-August here. This is one of the patterns we're seeing across Arizona, more so in Southeast than we are in Northern Arizona, is that there have been pockets of precipitation in some of those heavier thunderstorms that really have clobbered some spots. So just looking at the rain log data across Tucson, it's not, you don't have to go that far away from the airport, the official reading, to start to get rain log observations that are an inch and a half, 2 to 3 inches higher than that. So there are places in Tucson that actually have had 4.5 inches total for the monsoon season through yesterday. That's kind of interesting to look at. It is that some of our long-term observing spots, by and large, are below average, but we are getting some of those localized convective cells.
It's right. So we don't have, or at least I'm not looking at, more records up in Flagstaff. Rain log is nice here for Tucson. You can really see that sort of spatial differences. But up in Flagstaff, given that it's been so dry, I would expect there to be less spatial variability just because there's only been a few rain events.
It is interesting, though, because, and again, this is the real challenge of doing monsoon season well, us sort of talking about it and monitoring it really well, is over the handful of events that we've had since mid-July when things showed up through present, there have been a couple of repeat storms up near the Flagstaff area that have brought something closer to like 75% of average relative to the record dry. So really, it's bad luck that the airport didn't get hit by some of these storms. So some of the areas around there are not close to average. They're certainly below average, but actually have seen some precipitation.
Honing in on Tucson and looking at, hundreds of rain log points, it is true that some areas, particularly in the western area, Tucson Mountains area, has seen, 4 to 5 inches of rain, which would be above average. But then as you go up north into like Oro Valley, there's a lot of just 1 inchers.
Yeah, there's a lot less than the airport too.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe that's a way of sort of characterizing it, is that we have, by and large, across the region, most areas are below average. It kind of goes back to your point here, and we're looking at sort of the broad summary maps, is that 90% of the region is below average. And there are a handful of spots that are average, many fewer, less than that 10%, and even fewer percent that are above average.
Right. And New Mexico has been relatively better off.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, there's more area that's closer to near average in New Mexico than there are in Arizona.
That's right.
Is there any circulation patterns that might have set that up? Like maybe the position of the ridge was just more favorable for bringing in moisture into New Mexico. Was it an early season thing? Was it a late season thing? What's your take?
It was a bit of early season moisture. We have to go all the way back to June, where we saw a little bit of that activity, especially in eastern New Mexico, come in right after sort of monsoon start date, June 15th. So very early. It was probably more kind of Great Plains storm activity. We get into later in June, we started to see much more activity in New Mexico, not super heavy, not washouts, but more frequent precipitation there. And even in the beginning of July, July 7th, July 8th, New Mexico was actually getting regular afternoon thunderstorm, pretty widespread activity, and Arizona was kind of left out of it. We go through the rest of July, we see much more of that activity in sort of southern Arizona, some of it now into Arizona proper. New Mexico gets a little bit quiet, but if we look in the last couple of weeks, the activity has sort of shifted back into New Mexico. And even over the last couple of days, we've had this kind of strange, for this time of year, strange pattern where we're having kind of a trough of low pressure trying to push in from the north. And so then that gives us that transition pattern, and it was starting to funnel moisture up into New Mexico. Northwest Arizona was very dry, real hard edge of the moisture boundary. It was kind of draped across Tucson, and all that activity was up into New Mexico.
Do we often see this? I don't know the answer to this question. It just came to me. But do we often see differences or synergy or not between New Mexico and Arizona? So in other words, is a monsoon often okay in one area and bad in the other? Do they flip-flop?
Like canceling each other out?
Yeah, or when we have a decent monsoon, let's say last year, that both places equally get it. Is there at all sort of a flip-flop?
The bigger, broader correlation across the continental U.S. is if the Great Plains is wet, it's usually a signal that the Southwest is going to be dry, and vice versa.
Why would that be?
I can't remember. It has to do with the broader circulation pattern and the broader position of the ridge, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing some of that this year. And it was even thought that there would be that would be sort of a precursor pattern to what we might expect in the monsoon, which is, if you look back and remember what it was like, I believe in the Great Plains in the spring, it was really wet. Did I get that right? We should go back.
Yeah, I think so.
And take a look at that. But I think there was some indication of
because
weakness.
There was all the
flooding
floodings,
right there, right? And so this goes back to some papers by Wayne Higgins, who looked at sort of a dipole between the two of them. So in New Mexico, when we get into the monsoon season, we're really looking at the progression of the monsoon kind of moving up sort of north and to the northwest through the monsoon season. So I can think of many situations where it is fine for the entire region.
Right.
And thinking about how the sort of broader ridge pattern, and if the Four Corners High is in that position, puts us in deep easterly flow.
Right. So under the canonical or the ideal position of the ridge, let's say it's over the Four Corners area.
Yeah.
Both Arizona and New Mexico are under easterly flow, but there's also the circulation that seems perhaps more favorable for Arizona moisture, from the moisture to be brought up from Mexico into Arizona than it would for New Mexico. Is that? This
is why we're going to struggle to make sense of this monsoon season with a single bit of attribution. Like it was this thing.
It was the ridge.
Yeah, and I mean that's part of it.
Yeah.
I think to get everything to work together, having the ridge in a favorable position, so being north of Arizona or Four Corners High, why we're sort of fixated on the Four Corners High, that would lead to cooler mid-level temperatures. Those warmer mid-level temperatures would be north of us, and we would be on the cooler side of that ridge position. We would also ideally have a deep Gulf surge, so moistening up the lower levels from the deserts uphill and into the valleys and then up in the mountains in Arizona. And New Mexico has its own moisture source, which is coming out of, outflows out of Mexico, and then even some Great Plains moisture in the eastern part of the state.
Is the deep Gulf surge, so this is moisture streaming up from the Gulf of California, up into the deserts southwest, is that a function of the position of, it is in one sense a function of the position of the ridge, because if the ridge is south, you have sort of blocking and you're not going to get the moisture surge. But if there's other things that have to happen as well to get that surge besides just the position of the ridge.
Right. So they can be pretty disconnected, because we had a deep Gulf surge in the last couple of days, and in particular yesterday and in today, and the ridge is in a terrible spot. The high pressure system was directly overhead. You could even see it in the circulation pattern. So the Gulf surge activity, which is going to be triggered by the thunderstorm complexes coming off of Mexico, drifting over the mouth of the Gulf of California. We even had a tropical storm hurricane that was part of triggering that Gulf surge, is that can cause that seep of moisture up into Arizona. But in that position on the north side of the ridge, you are dragging in dry air from the Pacific on the north side, and then having the high pressure overhead is going to lead to those really warm mid-level temperatures. And we've seen some really, really high mid-level temperatures, which won't help the lapse rates that we need to generate that convection.
Yeah, so that's another important part, because you need those lapse rates. You need there to be a steep slope to help the sort of thermodynamics, to help the atmospheric instability, so that when you basically have warm at the surface and cooler in the upper levels, you're able to lift air higher and more.
You're leading to that convective instability that you need to have to sort of generate the deep convection and the rapid rates of convection, the convective available potential energy, the CAPE that we talk about quite a bit. And what you'll often see too is with the high pressure systems overhead, you'll see smaller inversions at upper levels, which will slow the rising of the thermals. They'll have to run into these inversions, which will impact the thermals basically rising up.
So you mentioned that we've had a number of instances in which there's been warmer temperatures aloft, and that's in part related to the position of the ridge.
It's almost all. I mean, so having the mid-level high pressure system is a realization of basically temperature patterns, right? So that where that high pressure system is where those highest temperatures are going to be associated with it. So again, thinking about ideally having
it's over us.
It's over us. Those are where the warmest temperatures are going to be. I mean, and it's fairly cleanly originated with that, because that geopotential height is related to the temperature of the column underneath it. Right?
But this, I think, is a good case point of just how hard sometimes it can be to wring out moisture of the atmosphere. Because so we've had this last couple days, Evo that you mentioned, the hurricane, in part helped push some moisture up through the Gulf surge. So we had moisture around, but then that's combating with the position of the ridge, which is causing warmer upper atmosphere, which is suppressing the convective ability. So you've got these two things that are sort of battling each other out.
Right.
And of course, when you have days or periods where they're both aligned, which we have been few and far between this year.
Yeah.
It's not like we haven't had moisture around.
That's been the interesting thing. We're looking at sort of the Tucson dew point trace. We were right on track as far as the uptick in dew points in late June, right into early July, which is when I was holding on dearly to a CLIMAS start. We had this absolute cratering of dew points to almost sort of record lows in Tucson, right past the fourth. Right around the first week, and then that was basically the westerlies, the kind of a late spring kind of cold front pattern sort of sweeping through and scouring out all that moisture and causing all that moisture to retreat back into Mexico. And then we had to do the rebuilding, and we're doing the rebuilding through the middle of July, and it wasn't until third week of July that we actually had enough to hang out that we were generating the conditions for the convection. And since then, we've really hung out near average, up and down around that, but haven't had the precip on top of it. So yeah, I think that you can have this, you can end up having this battle of having all that low-level moisture and just not having the other favorable conditions for rain down in the valleys. That's not to say that it hasn't been raining in some of the mountain regions.
And it would rain. Okay, so there's
generate the convection, in those higher elevation areas.
And then there's like the third ingredient that we always talk about is like the wind profile. And you kind of need winds to go in different directions as you go up.
Yeah.
And you need them to be strong.
Yeah. Ideally, we don't end up. So this is the interesting thing about the monsoon season is that since all the convection is happening underneath a ridge of high pressure, you don't end up having that much shear in the atmosphere. It's all happening underneath very low flow, low dynamic conditions in the sense of winds changing with height or winds changing speed with height, direction or speed. So
you don't have a lot of that.
You don't typically have a lot of that. And so when high pressure is right overhead, you're in a stagnant
environment,
part of the environment. So thinking again, what would be better? What would we more look for? Ridge building north, Four Corners High being to the north of us would put us in sort of a cooler mid-level airs, potentially stronger easterly flow on the south side of that high pressure system to the north of us. That would be better. We haven't had that very often, only a handful of times this whole season. What we've been dealing with instead is the ridge has been knocked to the east, to the southeast, and to the south repeatedly throughout the season. And it's interesting because if you look at the anomaly maps where we're looking at sort of difference of the geopotential heights from average, they don't look that different. So there's not a real good, clear signal that it's just totally out of whack this year. It's further south. The biggest anomalies in geopotential heights are actually over Mexico, which may be part of the reason that Mexico has had such a crummy monsoon season.
Well, and I think that's an important point to mention. We hit upon this last time too, but this isn't just a fringe monsoon. Like we're on the fringes of the monsoon here, so we're under historically more variability. But you can have a really good Sonoran monsoon going, and we can still have bad summer monsoon season.
Right.
But that hasn't happened this year. It's actually struggled down in Mexico as well.
Yeah. And
that I don't remember that being a narrative.
No.
Well, one thing that we have to talk about is it's been a while. We can get to this. It's been a while, at least for a large part of the monsoon region, where we've had a monsoon quite like this.
Yeah.
Like you have to go back to 2009, really. We'll talk about that.
We should talk about that because 2009 is actually was a terrible monsoon. It looks better. It looks better than. I'm seriously, it looks better than this one. Well,
let's get to that after deconstructing a little bit of Mexico, because I don't remember Mexico struggling as much. Mexican monsoon struggling as much as it has this year.
I don't either, and I don't have any good context for that climatologically. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center unified precip analysis, and we look at, they have a sort of a 90-day anomaly plot. All of Mexico is below average from the May 25th through the August 22nd period. And if we back that up to the last 30 days, things look a little better on the coastal areas, which is, I think, a nod to some of the tropical activity or clusters of thunderstorms getting to the coast. But the inland Mexico areas, all the way from southern to northern Mexico, are below average, right? So it's not that much of a surprise if we're the northern fringe of the monsoon season. If it's not showing up in earnest there's not real great mechanisms for us to get it and to not have
right. And one of those common mechanisms that we often get are these outflows from these mesoscale convective systems. So these big thunderstorm systems that create their own weather, basically.
Yeah.
They're pushing air and moisture north, and they're also creating those dynamics. They're creating lift. They're helping overcome they're creating that instability that's needed, more or less. And when you have a core region that is struggling, you're going to have fewer of those.
Yeah.
We have had our fair share of MCSs, as they call. I don't know if they've been lower than average or less than average.
Yeah, I know. Climatology, that would be really interesting. I don't know. I can't really think of it. And I could think about, I'm kind of envisioning looking at the climatological position of the subtropical high. It has wandered north, has wandered south. I feel like it's been sort of centered over northern Mexico, southern Arizona. And if you think about that flow pattern, a lot of those easterly waves are going to be pushed south if they even are able to sort of traverse across at all. And then kind of following around that high, you can get some of those MCSs, or probably more appropriately, the mesoscale convective vortices, just the leftover vortices that are sort of trailing up through Arizona
from the
leftover
waves.
Well, yeah, it could be easterly wave, could be leftover clusters of thunderstorms from the previous night. I don't know if it's been more or less. It certainly hasn't done a lot for Arizona. I mean, the stats on the precip really show that. And I think another interesting pattern about this monsoon season too is that the activity has really been confined to southeast Arizona. And if you look at the map of total precip, it looks like the early monsoon season stuck. It's like you should see that progression up through all of Arizona into northern Arizona, along higher elevation, up the Mogollon Rim, through July and into August. Instead, it looks like kind of early July, just stuck. Like we never progressed past the precip pattern that we would see in early July.
Yeah, so let's put this a little bit in historical perspective, because you and I are guilty of monsoon washing.
Or what? You're going to lump me in on that? Monsoon washing?
I don't know. I was trying to.
What is that?
the last 3 years, right? Like we've been a little bit spoiled.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think I have recency bias on my monsoon expectations for sure.
Just in terms of the quality of the monsoon, let's just speak about Tucson for the moment as an analog for the broader region. Last year it started early and it was above average the entire time. 2 years ago, it chugged along. It started kind of on time-ish, but then it went gangbusters. And 2016, 3 years ago, kind of started on time and was above average the entire time.
Right, and this is Tucson.
This is Tucson.
I think in it definitely is varied across the region for sure.
Thank you, Mike.
You're Tucson washing now.
Okay, so 2015 it was sort of close to average. 2014 it was some kind of close to average.
Yeah.
Again, 2013, actually, you have to go back to 2013 before we had in Tucson a relatively bad monsoon. And it started early then.
And 2013 was really only bad for Tucson.
Didn't start early. It started on time.
Started on time.
Yeah. Okay. So it was only bad for...
Yeah. And the rest of the state got pretty much walloped. And most of New Mexico was 2 times the average.
That's right.
It's really interesting. We go back through these maps for the last couple of years. There are pockets of locations that are, 150 to 200 to 250% of average. I don't know if we're going to have any spots this year that have any local anomalies to that level. And so that then starts to look a little bit more like going back to 2011.
So what do you think is the analog year right now?
Well, for a location or the region?
No, let's do the region. I think it's better to do the region. I mean, for Tucson, we could do Tucson too, but let's do the region.
2011 wasn't great. I think 2011 is a possibility, which, gosh, man, if you think back to 2011 was a drought winter and a drought summer. And so that's a double whammy, which is not great at all.
2011 looks very comparable.
2009 was one of the worst total monsoon seasons we had seen in the last 10 to 15 years. But 2009 was interesting, and 2009 largely had an on-time start and a decent July, and then it just stopped in August.
And this is for Tucson? Or
you could see it in Tucson. You see it more across central and northern Arizona, less so in New Mexico that year. New Mexico, I think, did fared a little bit better. But 2009, I remember, was a pretty
And this is the one where you said it's looking better than this year.
Yeah.
Before,
Yeah.
2009 in Tucson came in at just under 3 inches of rain. So,
Just the poor timing of this year. So it's not only, there's monsoons like 2009 where the activity can kind of come in earnest right early and then peter out, which has its own set of implications. So I think in those situations you can stem fire activity earlier, maybe limit it for the rest of the season. This year was late and then just weak. Yeah. And so, I guess the upside is that in those kinds of, I don't know if you want to call it a false start, but just sort of a strong start, weak finish, is that you can cause a lot of summer vegetation to sprout and then die midsummer because it can't sustain. Maybe an upside here is that nothing grew, so it couldn't die.
That is one way of being optimistic.
Yeah, I guess. And it comes off of a wet winter. So that's slightly different from a drought situation is that there is water available in sort of deeper soil that I think has helped stem some of the sort of shorter term drought impacts. So it's not quite like a 2011 situation where I'm trying to even think if the drought of 2011, was that spring that lingered into the summer as well. So that's kind of that puts you in a real different drought situation spot.
Now, the other analog, at least for Tucson, is 2004. And 2004 was a year in which...
I kind of remember that, yeah.
It started late. Like the first real precip event at the airport was July 16th, and it never got going. And, it finished with 2.4 inches of rain. So 2004 is one of the analogs that come up for this year if in Tucson area. There is one big difference, however, and that is this year has been exceptionally hot.
Yeah. And
it wasn't necessarily the case. It was kind of right around average that year for for Tucson, but we're running max temperatures are kind of off the charts.
Yeah.
Across the region, which you would expect in a drier than average monsoon, but not to the degree, I think.
Yeah, and I think if you went back and did some pretty specific diagnostics on these given years, 2005, I bet the circulation pattern was different, and what the mechanism that was driving that sort of drier than average conditions. If you look at 2004 was not terrible across the entire region. I think it was just bad at the airport. It was even some of the surrounding areas kind of came in at average, and most of the Mogollon Rim average to slightly below average. This year, I do think having the subtropical ridge, the high in particular, the mid-level high overhead, constantly wandering back around, is both shutting down the moisture and leading to these just sort of epic surface temperatures.
Yeah, so July, in this part of the country, July gets about 11 days. August gets about 11 days over 100 degrees in Tucson. We've had 17 so far.
Ugh.
And in the entire record, I think in July there was, in Tucson, there was 25 days with above 100 degrees. 100 degrees or above. Only 1 year had more than that. Yeah. So anyway, the point being that it's been a really hot summer as well, which exacerbates the lack of rain in terms of water balance issues.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the Tucson record again, August of 2011, which man, I forgot about how bad that summer was. We set numerous daily record highs in August of 2011, which was also one of our analog years as far as dry conditions. Oof. So
a week left in August. We have about a month left of the monsoon. It's the time period where we start to look toward the East Pacific for any moisture that would waft in from remnant storm. Mike, can we turn this bus around?
Turn this frown upside down? I'm trying, Zach. I'm trying desperately. The outlooks, which I've been hanging on the Climate Prediction Center long. I can't see anything in the 3 to 5 day forecast, the 1 to 2 or the 3 to 5. So I'm always looking at the 6 to 10 or the 8 to 14 to look for any hope. The 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 for the last couple of days have been painted green for the Southwest, for Arizona and New Mexico.
Meaning? Pretty
regularly that there's a shift in the probability towards above average precipitation over that week period we're looking out. So this
8 to 14?
8 to 14. So this would be August 31st through September 6th. And the discussions have been pretty consistent that the expectation is that the East Pacific is coming to life as far as tropical activity. The idea that we're going to have an enhancement of the whole sort of monsoon system up Mexico, and then possibly the influence of some of these tropical storms impacting the moisture source.
And the sea surface temperatures there are
above average. They've been above average. So going into the monsoon season, the outlooks were all... So if we kind of go back to this, there was in June this lean towards later than average start, and then really a punt on August and September. Not even a punt. I think there was an actual forecast that showed showed above average precipitation. Right. So when we were in June, we were concerned about a later than average start. I wasn't. I was pretty bullish on thinking a CLIMAS start, and that was clearly wrong. But the outlooks were really considering August and September to be above average. I think it was based on the East Pacific
and that was in part fueled by what then was considered a weak El Nino.
Weak El Nino and above average sea surface temps in the East Pacific.
And the weak El Nino would have its effect on the East Pac tropical storms by reducing shear.
Yeah, but I think there was actually enhanced shear across the East Pacific. I'm not totally sure on what has shut down, but the East Pacific.
But in terms of like the El Nino,
like what the reasoning was behind that, and so the the Climate Prediction Center and ConAgua both had above average seasons forecast. This was in late May, so looking forward to the summer. So, that by itself is a useful bit of information to sort of understand where your monsoon season may go. And
the latter half.
later in August and September.
It'd be interesting to see how often the monsoon needed a dollop from a tropical storm to actually become an above average.
Yeah, I know. And I think there's some really good, interesting research questions that it's maybe in the literature. I haven't seen the paper. We'll have to do a little bit of digging on this, or it just hasn't been done, but is to try to parse out the climatological sources of the moisture and look at them climatologically just to see how important they are. And I still go back to, I'm not convinced that we had a good sense, even in June, how July would turn out, even though it did turn out late and that was what the official forecast was. I'm still not sold on the...
But I have to go back to this.
Yeah.
And we mentioned this before because I really think that it was a late start more by chance than it was by anything else, because there was moisture around.
Yeah.
And I do remember Mike Leuthold's blog, Arizona Forecast Discussion, where he was mentioning that he just hadn't seen, for the amount of moisture that was around, as little of precipitation squeezed out of it as possible.
No. And like if bad luck.
If you just had some other mechanisms set up there, the moisture was around, we wouldn't be saying it's an early start or a late start.
Yeah, I think that's true. So, but then we really wouldn't have had the subsequent activity to lock it in, right? So would we have called it an early start or an on-time start and then had it go dry through the end of July? I mean, this is whole characterization. Is that a late start, or is that just a burst break activity in the monsoon? I mean, I think we can do a lot better job of characterizing the monsoon as a whole and activity throughout the monsoon, which we've talked quite a bit about, because it is sort of a coherent thing and sort of isn't. It's kind of jello-y once we get into the middle of the monsoon season. My thing is that what were the indications going into the monsoon season? Because if we see them again, is that a good forecast? I'm not sure.
So what were they?
It was really what it was the anomalously late cool season activity we're seeing in May and even into early June. But we had kind of
wait, late cool. So
just remember how cool it was in May?
Yeah, that's right. I do.
We even had precipitation, and so there's old.
That was right.
There's
was
tales.
A temperature
yeah,
there.
there's tales in Arizona where they have sayings like rain in June, no monsoon. So if you look at some of the long-term records here, the correlations aren't really there. I do think that happens sometimes, but I think
rain in June,
is
not the temperature
correlating, right? Well, I think it all is trying to speak back to the same thing. Okay. Is that if there's rain in June, and if it's in early June, it's usually going to be sort of late season spring activity. It's not monsoonal at that point. Right. Maybe it is. Maybe it's tropical at that point. It's hard. Then you'd have to kind of parse that out of what the mechanism is. But the idea is then if it's raining in June, that you're not going to have a monsoon. So it's somehow pointing backwards to having this lingering trophy sort of springtime pattern that's going to cause the monsoon ridge to have trouble struggling forward. We actually looked at a lot of this, and there's kind of equal instances where that is the case and equal instances where that isn't the case. And in the literature, the idea of western snowpack and monsoon is in some papers, but it's also it's also contradicted in other papers. It's not a well-vetted idea, and it's not even really clear in the literature or in the data.
And that's like a negative correlation, like high or widespread snowpack that persists into the spring.
Right.
The hypothesis was, or some of the early 2000s empirical evidence suggested that might actually lead to a late monsoon, and therefore a less vigorous monsoon.
Right. So it's going to translate into sort of a land surface memory that'll suppress the progression of the ridge north. Kind of, it makes sense in some instances, and there may certainly be...
The evidence is all over the place on that, though, at the moment.
I think so, too. And I also think that is possible and may have happened a couple of times, but it doesn't seem to be a consistent signal. It's like not like the attribution here, I think can't use that as sort of pure attribution or even as a solid forecast.
Okay, so we had a temperature signal. That was that one might have used to hedge against a dry beginning.
Yeah. Oh, you're saying because it was cool in May and cool in June that was suggesting that.
Well, I thought that's what you were saying.
It is. I think that's the case. But we've had that before, right? We've had that.
I'm just trying to figure out like
we've had that before and things have turned around. Yeah.
I mean, they got the forecasts. Like if if we go back to the Climate Prediction Center's forecast, they were calling for sort of a late start and a weakish beginning. Right? So they got it right.
Yeah, that's right. And that was on the 1 month, and it was also on the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14. Yep.
And your point, I think, is a good one, which is, okay, they got the forecast, but did they get the forecast right for the right reasons?
Right. And I think that at the 1 month scale, it was probably more climate signals and sort of analogs and sort of using that as a potential reason. But once you get in 6 to 10 and 8 to 14, it's going to be the actual dynamical models. And so the dynamical models at that point were really like, this is really struggling. And they've largely been right as we've kind of gone through the season that they've shown this. So more broadly, I was kind of poking around looking for like, okay, what is there some kind of index that would maybe point to this? There really isn't anything other than the Arctic oscillation is the only thing that's been consistently negative.
So this is where I was going to go. I do remember that the jet was sort of all over the place. It's
been wavy. It's strengthened and weakened. It's been further south. But man, this goes all the way back to December. We've seen this signal. And if you look at the correlations between the Arctic oscillation and geopotential heights across continental U.S., they're fairly well correlated it's really across the northern Great Plains, but you could see how it would extend into influencing the subtropical ridge down here even. So this isn't a forecasting thing. It's more of like trying to get back to attribution. I don't know what's causing the Arctic oscillation to be negative. Like, I don't know what the mechanism is going
negative
forward.
So effectively that would mean that the Arctic air that the winds that are ripping around the Arctic are a little bit slackened and can sort of droop down further. It's further south, and so you get more of a wavy jet stream.
Right. It's you can think of it as sort of the ring of the, and again, in the summertime, this isn't really as much of a mechanism or something we see in the summertime, but so it's been negative relatively speaking to what it should be in the summertime, which, signals, I think, back to the progressive jet, what we've been fighting, which is the mid-latitude westerlies, which have been sort of whipping the west coast.
But if you had that wavy jet, it would be fighting against the ridge position.
It could. I mean, it could also block. It could get into a blocking position where it enhances the ridge. It could build across the western U.S. and you get yourself in a really good spot. I think ideally...
But that didn't happen this year.
No, it did not.
It can go the other way.
Sure, yeah. And I think the fact that it's been kind of moving around has been problematic for us in that ridge. Ideally, I think what you want is you want the westerlies to stagnate. You want the western U.S. to basically stagnate and let the ridge sort of build on its own dynamically across the western U.S.
Keep those winds north.
Yeah, we want to be in the easterlies, right? We want to be on the southern side of that high pressure system. We really haven't been much. We've been in the westerlies. Man, it's looked like June or September most of July and August.
We need a high pressure generator.
This is weather modification. I think this is Google. I'd say you
Google's working on it.
I was going to say you could submit a grant to Google to see if we could whip that up.
We're running long in the wind here, but one thing I did want to get to, which we were sort of floating the trial balloon this year on
our fantasy weather,
on our fantasy monsoon.
It was a fantasy. I think that was mostly what we.
It just needed to rain.
Yeah, exactly.
Needed the rain, and so just to. Because I think it's a really good idea. If people that are into fantasy sports, they get to pick players and how those players perform determines how you perform. And we pick stations and of course none of the stations performed this year, so it doesn't really matter. But Mike, so your stations for the last month, July 15th to August 15th, you had Portal in southeast Arizona, and then you had Flagstaff and Prescott.
Seemed like safe picks.
Yes. So why did you think they were safe?
Because it was August. It was supposed to be raining at upper elevations. I mean, this is nuts.
Well, so that's it. I wanted to bring this up before, but the fact that Flagstaff is so dry.
Oh, just miserable.
I mean, to me, that's like there's just no moisture up there.
Well, I think it also points to the ridge position. They've been in the westerlies most of the summer. I mean, they're so far north, it's been perennial June in this monsoon season.
Yeah, and I had picked for that same reason in June. Between June 15th and July 15th, I had picked Kick Peak, and
Kip Peak has been epically bad.
You were speculating that somebody
I'm not sure that
broke the rain gauge.
I wonder. I think Ben said that maybe the rain gauge is broke. But
what's the deficit right now?
It's like 5 inches. It's 5 inches below average, which it could be some missing data, but it's not good.
Yeah. So needless to say, I think we've already gone over the pattern in the west, southwest here, which is pretty much dry everywhere. In terms of this monsoon fantasy, Mike, we're basically at a tie for being.
So we both picked 3 stations, and the total percent of average was what, 145 for you and 143 for me?
Yeah.
So on average, each station got less than half.
That's right, because the total should be 300%.
Yeah, 300% if everybody hit their average.
That's right.
I honestly didn't expect us to have numbers this low.
Well, it's also amazing that we're so darn close.
That's
145% total.
Yeah, I think that's actually within the error margin. So I think we should call it a tie.
Okay, so the monsoon fantasy.
You're going to go for that?
The monsoon fantasy. No, it's not a tie. It's not a statistical tie because I want the beer.
2%. Okay, fair enough.
Actually, it probably is a statistical.
I'm sure
tie.
it is.
Yeah,
I'm sure it is. But I'll buy your beer. Don't worry.
Okay, so our last month of fantasy monsoon.
Are we doing it?
Yeah, we're doing it.
Okay. What's the dates through?
July, August
16th. That's already happened. Ooh, I should look at the numbers then. I want something out east. I wish. Who knew Aho? Aho is killing it this year.
No, let's just do September. We'll do September.
Yeah, let's just do all of September. I think that's good. That could be interesting. Yeah, I like that.
I'm gonna go first.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm gonna go Flagstaff, and the reason I'm going Flagstaff.
All right, I like
the reason I'm going Flagstaff is I'm using the regress toward the mean logic. I'm not doing the persistence forecast here, so it's regressing toward the mean, which means it's going to get rain, and I'm going to take that same logic for Phoenix.
Okay,
and particularly because Phoenix can receive sort of in the line of fire of a recurring tropical storm.
So you're going. Okay, I like this.
And then I'm going Albuquerque.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
I don't know the climatology of Albuquerque for September.
Okay.
Tell me why that's a bad pick.
I don't know. I think it's far north.
Yep. I'm thinking it's going to get.
It could get a snowstorm. I mean, I don't know if that counts. But.
I was actually thinking it's non-monsoon related.
It could, yeah.
I'm trying to go to areas that aren't influenced.
If it's frozen precip, it does not count.
Does anybody know quickly, if I talk slow enough, maybe Ben will provide the statistics. What is September's climatology for Albuquerque? 1.08.
Interesting. Okay.
We're doing percent of average though, so oh boy, I'm sticking with it.
Interesting.
Ben just said in 2013 they got 3.97. So that would be 400% of average.
Interesting.
That's my
2017
2.2. Yeah, that's not such a bad bet.
It's not a bad bet. I'm just trying to think about. They have actually had. It's been a long time, but they've had recurving tropical storms from the Gulf of Mexico.
Boom.
It's possible. I think it's not as likely, but sure, I'll give it to you. Okay.
Right, now that you've had time to actually look at maps and
you know what I'm going Yuma. That
I thought about Yuma.
Yeah, you know what Yuma's last period was? Yuma's last period from July 15th through August 15th was 5% of average, which I'm not even sure is correct. They had 0.03 of an inch in one storm. But just think about if they get that tropical storm, that one that comes right up the Gulf, parks over Yuma.
That's a soaker.
I could get 10,000%.
What did they get from Odile?
I don't think they got anything out of Odile.
Actually, that's right because that was too far south.
So I'm going. This is my tropical.
But there was
team.
one a couple years ago that hit Phoenix, if I remember correctly, right?
Well, we had moisture from one of the storms, and this was in August, and that was.
Anyway, I'm taking you off your game.
No, so it's. I agree. I think it's going to be low elevation. It's my tropical team. I'm going to do Yuma.
Ooh, tropical team.
Tropical team. I'm going to do Portal.
You did Portal last time, but you can do it again.
Well, I'm just thinking of an Odile slam dunker.
Oh, so you're all going south. I went.
This is it. The shot is it's going to be tropical, and this is actually unfortunately predicated on it being an actual recurving storm, which are low odds. That's an outsider right there.
Those are low odds.
All right, maybe a safer high elevation location. It's going to be in the White Mountains. I'm going to do Show Low. Yep.
I like Show Low.
Yep.
All right.
Whew. I feel better talking it out.
That's the monsoon deconstruction. And, hopefully we'll have a lot to talk about in a month about the monsoon, and if not, we'll just move right along.
Talk about what?
Talk about
neutral El Nino coming up.
Yeah,
maybe we'll just talk about Christmas.
Well, thanks so much for your time as always.
It's fun, Zach, and go tropical storms.
Tropical team. You ready to rock?
Maybe. Freaking out, man. I'm freaking out. Okay.
There's way too many open tabs.
Way too many open tabs here. This is not a good sign.